Okay, thank you for your patience as I kind of deal with some tech today as well. So like I said, my name is Catie Fowler. I'm the Human Trafficking Project Coordinator with the Colorado Department of Public Safety and also the Colorado Human Trafficking Council. And I'm really just here today to give a review of our 2022 annual report. And this year featuring some lovely photography cover art from one of our council members, Caleb Stewart. So happy to have some free artwork. So to start off, I want to share some of the key priorities that we had in 2022. And there were really several of these, as you can see here. So at the council's retreat in January of last year, we decided that we would continue to do some things and also start some new initiatives. So one of the things that we kind of decided to continue was to fulfill our legislative mandate to collect data on incidents of trafficking and efforts to address it in the state. That's not really an option, but it is something that's important to our team to do. We also decided to continue our training program. So we continued those efforts in 2022, and I apologize, some of this has been cut off a little bit, but I'll always explain the headings. And we finally also decided to maintain our public awareness campaign called This is Human Trafficking for one more year of grant funding in 2022. We also started some new initiatives. So we started working to identify and address human trafficking of children and youth with a systematic statewide approach. I'll talk more about that later. That's actually what I was hired on to help with. We also decided to have 3 different task forces if this wasn't enough. So we added a task force on survivor engagement, a task force on legislation, and a task force on equitable access for victims of human trafficking in rural areas specifically. So that's a lot, and I'm gonna try to get through it, but let me know if you have questions. So starting with our data, we primarily focus on incidents of human trafficking in Colorado that's reported to law enforcement, reported by service providers, and also including any calls to, for example, the national or state hotline. We have a wonderful state hotline in Colorado, or any screenings for human trafficking that we see in Division of Youth Services or Department of Human Services. So some really broad trends that we saw in 2021. All of this data is for 2021, calendar year 2021, because we want to be able to collect a full year of data before we report out on it. So in 2021, we saw some really broad trends. One is that we saw an increase in incidents of sex trafficking that were reported by local law enforcement and Homeland Security. And this we actually attribute to a rise in human trafficking task forces, which is a good thing because we have seen an increase in sex trafficking for focused task forces in Colorado. And so their strength is really identifying sex trafficking. So this increase in reporting is actually just kind of an increase in awareness and ability to identify. We saw a different trend with our service providers. We reported on 4 out of 5 federally funded service providers, and we actually saw about half supporting more labor trafficking clients and the other half supporting more sex trafficking clients. So different trends there. And if we look at our judicial filings, so this is for the 3-year period actually from 2019 to 2021, we see some similar trends. So naturally with law enforcement doing a little bit more, identifying more sex trafficking cases, it makes sense that we see more sex trafficking cases reflected here, both for adults and minors. But we also have seen this kind of decrease, as you can see in the past few years, getting fewer and fewer cases that are really specific to that human trafficking statute. Now, that doesn't mean that somebody may be a trafficker and be charged with a crime, but it's that specific use of a statute that seems to kind of be going down over time. This might just be because the statute is kind of farther out now. The statute is from 2014, so there's a lot of initiative to try to convict under that statute, and then over time people kind of start having that same incentive to convict using that statute. One potential explanation. And then another trend that you can't see in the data here is that actually the majority of these cases are filed in Denver. So about 60%, just a little over 60% are the Denver metro area. About 24% are actually here in El Paso and Teller counties, And then the rest of the cases are elsewhere in the state. So not a really even distribution in terms of where the cases are being filed from. And you can also see it's really actually quite challenging. These are dispositions of cases from 2019 to 21. It's really quite difficult to actually get that human trafficking specific conviction. So we have about 7 really specific human trafficking convictions. We have 38 in those 3 years that were convicted for another crime. These were all other sex-related crimes. So these would have all been sex trafficking cases. And then you see some were pending, some were dismissed, but that really big number, that 38, is just convicted for other charges, even though there might have been trafficking involved. And again, if we look back as far as 2014, we also see the same trend when it comes to sex trafficking versus labor trafficking. So you can see this big yellow portion, 92% are for sexual servitude. And then we have only 4 cases that have been actually filed for involuntary servitude. And that hasn't really changed very much since 2020. So that's something that hasn't shifted very much, and it seems much harder to get those convictions.
Could you define the difference between those two?
So in terms of what charges they're looking at, or?
The terms, involuntary servitude and sexual servitude.
So involuntary servitude, and this is an interesting point, right? Because conceptually, a lot of us might say, well, trafficking, in many ways, both of these could be considered a type of labor, right? But so for the involuntary servitude, we're thinking what people typically think of when they think of labor trafficking more. So that might be domestic, that might be agricultural, it might be working for a magazine, right? Those types of labor. And for all of our sexual servitude, where we might have related convictions would be pimping or prostitution. So kind of in that realm. Is that helpful? Yeah.
So is that saying that many of the victims of human trafficking are the ones that get charged?
No. So these convictions would be for what the judicial system is seeing as a perpetrator of trafficking. So the charges would be for somebody who's exploiting somebody for their labor. And there is, and this isn't reflected here, it would be very tricky data to actually pull out. There is, of course, always a concern that people who experience trafficking might also be charged for crimes that they commit because they're in a trafficking situation. That's not what we're talking about here, but that's actually something that is of concern to the council as well. So I'll get to that in our task force recommendations, but really great question. Any other questions while we're here? Great. So then kind of looking at our service providers, this is distribution of Colorado OVC clients, so federally funded service provider clients in 2021. We actually see some really kind of different trends here. So we see one organization that has significantly more labor trafficking clients. And so we have a couple that are a little bit more on the labor trafficking end, but one's very significant, and a couple that are serving more sex trafficking clients than labor trafficking clients. So very different distribution amongst those service providers in particular. It doesn't mean there aren't other non-federally funded providers who are also doing this work. This is the data that we're able to easily capture without, accidentally putting clients at risk of having their information be too identifiable, for example. And we can also see pretty similar trends in 2021 in terms of the immigration status of those clients. So in the green here, we see significantly more foreign nationals being served in a couple of these organizations. And then in the blue, we see that a couple are serving more citizens or US permanent residents. So fairly kind of even distribution in terms of the type of clients those organizations are serving, although one certainly serving significantly more foreign nationals. And so finally, just the last few little points about our data section is we saw some trends in our screening processes. So basically, how do we identify when trafficking might be occurring? So Division of Youth Services screens every single child that they come into contact with using the high-risk victim screening tool for trafficking. We saw a decrease in those screenings in 2021. We also saw a decrease in the number of assessments with an allegation of sex or labor trafficking that went through Department of Human Services, but more of those cases were founded. So even though they were asking that question less often, they were seeing more cases where there was a founded concern that somebody was being exploited. And then when it came to our hotline, this is something I think we're very happy about, actually. The national hotline saw fewer calls nationally by a slight amount, and it saw slightly more calls for Colorado specifically. But the Colorado human trafficking hotline saw a really sharp increase in calls and texts. And we're seeing this as a good thing because one of the things that we really wanted to push in the last couple of years was our awareness campaign. And one thing we did with that awareness campaign is send people to the Colorado human trafficking hotline when they had concerns they wanted to report. So this reporting doesn't necessarily indicate that there's more trafficking in Colorado, but we hope that it is indicating this greater awareness. People are more willing to report because they know what they're looking for and they're looking to call in and to be helpful in that way.
Katie, I have a question.
Yes.
So refresh me on where and how you marketed that awareness campaign. Where would someone have seen that hotline number?
It's a perfect question. I will actually talk all about that when I talk about our public awareness campaign.
Okay.
So when we get there, if you have more questions, absolutely let me know.
You said that concluded at the end of 2022. So you're really
Yes.
looking back at it. This is not something that's,
Yes.
you're not funded through that grant anymore, right?
Yeah, so we used up all of our grant funding as much as we could. So we're now getting a few requests. So this is an interesting question, but we are getting some requests for new materials that we don't have the funds to produce right now. So for example, we can have people print them themselves or pay for them, but we are out, just completely wiped out of our funding from that initial grant. And that doesn't mean we're not going to look for more possibilities, but at the moment we are paused with what we can do. Yeah.
When was that grant for?
I think that was an OVC grant as well. To be very honest, I was not
You weren't
heavily,
here.
I was not heavily involved in the public awareness campaign funding, especially, but that was federally funded as well.
I just remember someone came and talked about it at the very beginning. you
That
know,
may
when
have
it
been
was
Maria
in the
or Alex,
works, and
yeah.
I thought it was gonna be bigger than I think it was. And like, I remember them talking about billboards and I was just thinking.
Yeah,
see it
we
at
did
the
actually,
airport.
yeah, we did some awareness at Denver. I'll get there.
Okay.
And that, yes,
Okay.
but I will get there. These are good questions.
Okay, good.
I just had, are you gonna talk more about the hotline? Because I'm wondering if you're seeing an increase, are you seeing it in pockets in the Colorado area? And I'm curious as to what, I don't know if you have this information, but once someone calls a hotline,
Mhm.
what services, what are you helping them with most?
Great question. So I wish I had somebody here from the Laboratory to Combat Human Trafficking because they actually run the hotline and they would have better answers to your question than I will. But essentially when you call the hotline, you can expect that you will be kind of receiving a warm handoff to services or, investment or, even an appropriate law enforcement tip. I don't know the process as well as they would because they run it. It's all volunteer staff. It does an amazing job. And from what I have heard from folks who are using it or connecting to services that way, it's been very effective. But since I'm not on that side of things, I can't speak to all of your questions.
So I guess with the campaign, the advertising campaign,
Mhm.
I'm just wondering if it's picking up more in areas outside of Denver or Colorado Springs. Are there pockets that you're seeing trends in?
Yeah. To be honest, I don't have that data off the top of my head, but I'd be really happy to look into it because that's something that we're really trying to actually do with our public awareness. So you guys have great questions. I love this. So I'm going to talk about training and then I'll talk about public awareness, although now I wish my slides were switched. So we offered several trainings in 2022. So this is 2022 data now. We have our introduction to human trafficking in Colorado. This is really just a basic human trafficking 101. It can be for community members. It can be for new service providers, for law enforcement, but it's basically anything that just your common person would need to know about human trafficking, be able to have a conversation about it. We also have a human trafficking investigations course. This course is focused on law enforcement, and it's really to help prepare those personnel identify and address trafficking. And we finally also have a service provider workshop. This is a 4-hour intensive workshop that works really effectively in communities to kind of help them help each other and also really kind of dig into the work they're already doing. And all of these have very many different modules and different ways that they're presented. So some of them have an online model. We have a Spanish version of an introduction to human trafficking in Colorado. And we do instructor-led, in-person, and virtual for all of them, and train the trainer to try to get them out into communities because we have a small but mighty team and can't be everywhere. So trying to kind of reach as many people as possible with some really wonderful volunteers. And I should say, I see some people maybe taking interest in our trainings. One little plug that I'll make, and I'll have contact information for our human trafficking training and technical assistance lead, is we have an online module that we just finished developing for law enforcement, and we're looking for law enforcement personnel to help beta test it. So if you know law enforcement folks who are interested in this type of training, want to help us out on the technical side just to make sure everything's running smoothly from a user end, I have contact information from you, and I would love to kind of set you up with that. So from January to November 30th, because we had to kind of stop reporting and start writing to get this out on time, we trained 883 individuals. And this is a 25% increase from the year prior, which is 2021. That's because we were in the height of the pandemic during that time. It's just much harder, especially to do in-person trainings. You can see most of those folks were taking our 101, but we also have some professionals that were taking our law enforcement and service provider offerings as well. And I think this data probably went up slightly towards the end of the year, but I don't have those exact numbers available at the moment. So hopefully to answer some questions here. We were quite busy with our public awareness campaign in 2022, starting with National Human Trafficking Prevention Month, which I know all of you know is a very busy time if you work in anti-trafficking spaces as well. So this month really started with a proclamation from Governor Polis declaring January 11th Colorado's Human Trafficking Awareness Day. The video is sufficient, but not extremely inspiring, so I will not share it right now for time, but you're welcome to view it if you would like later. One of our initiatives in January was also to release a video production of convicting human trafficking in Colorado. So this was an expert panel of Colorado professionals who actually participated in the successful conviction of a labor trafficker. So trying to give some kind of awareness about what labor trafficking is, how it's convicted, maybe a little bit of kind of training out there on how others can do the same in the future. And we kind of really got fun with it. We had a partnership with Colorado State Patrol. So this is some of our campaign material wrapped around one of the State Patrol vehicles. We did quite a bit on social media. So we had paid content that we put up, organic content we put up. Unsurprisingly, when you pay for content, you get more impressions. So that end of it was a little bit more successful. So this is one of our paid posts. And we also worked on this page of our public awareness website. And this is important because we designed this page with feedback that was obtained from survivor leaders. And the message is really focused on reaching and engaging potential victims and survivors of human trafficking from that lens. So to kind of give more information on that side of things. We also reached out and tried to do some public awareness around transit. So kind of to answer some of your questions, Lisa. So this is one of our posts up at DIA. And we also had a wraparound on the Denver light rail. So this messaging is going kind of, you can see back a couple cars at least. And we actually did get quite a bit more awareness than we initially expected from transit messaging like this. So we had 24 million impressions from DIA, 20 million from the Denver bus market, and 7 million from the Denver light rail specifically. So this was more than we initially anticipated.
Impressions.
So impressions are kind of, if somebody scans in and we can see that it's from very specific messaging, then we have a sense, oh, okay. So now somebody's accessing our website because they saw this here at DIA or, you know, on this light rail.
Did they do it through QR code?
Yeah.
That's how you link it to they saw this, they scan the code, and then they go to your website. Is that how it works?
Yes. Yeah. So I've been learning new things about QR codes and all they can do since I started.
So, but it's just in Denver.
So yeah, these efforts are all in Denver. However, one other thing we did is we tried to be as grassroots as possible. And so we brought smaller versions of our campaign messaging across the state of Colorado. So I know that Joanne has brought in some of this messaging here, but we had our posters, window clings, stickers, and we had coasters for bars and restaurants. And Maria and our public awareness point person with our consulting firm that helped us with this campaign, they did their absolute best to get out to communities actually far outside of the Denver metro area where this messaging is not as common. So hitting up welcome centers and gas stations and rest stops on the way, local businesses, local public health centers, really trying to get this messaging out, even in small places. We did use some of these funds as a push in Denver for Human Trafficking Awareness Month this January, which wasn't a part of this report. But that was really the last of our materials that we had widely available. And then something else that we did, and I'll pass these around, and this is a good example of the QR code and how it can be useful, is we produced these covert goods. So I think it looks like you're familiar with our lip balms. We had lip balms that can go out. So this is, you know, if you're at a public health center, for example, and you come into contact with somebody you expect is being trafficked, you can give this to them and then they have access to the QR code that takes them to our website and you can give them information about how to call the hotline. So I'll pass those around. That's our vanilla scented one, but it is closed, so you can't smell it. I have one that I keep in my purse and I always pull it out and go, oh, I can't use this one.
So how would you communicate with someone about this? Like, I mean,
so
what language do you use to let them know there's a QR code that you might want to scan, or they're just supposed to figure it out?
So you would want to tell, I mean, I don't think I would, even as a millennial, I probably wouldn't really have a lot of natural curiosity about an unexplained QR code.
Okay.
So we do, and we have kind of specific guidelines that we've given to providers that we have distributed these to. So for example, and I'm getting to your language piece, we don't necessarily distribute them to providers who only worked with people they know are confirmed victims of human trafficking. Because at that point, we kind of have an expectation at that point in intervention that we already know that they've been identified as somebody who's having that experience. So this would be, you know, somebody comes into a public health clinic or, you know, another service, and the service provider is concerned but doesn't have enough information really, or doesn't have the ability to intervene. They might say, hey, I'm really worried about you. If you ever need help, there might be some information on the QR code. And that's really for the future. You would not, for example, say that in front of somebody you suspect may be a trafficker. And I know, and I'm not a service provider currently myself, but I know that there are a lot of protocols that, you know, for example, forensic nurses or medical professionals will have around wanting to have some separation from a concerned partner or family member, friend, cousin, you know, whoever that is that comes in with somebody, just for that reason, so they can have some privacy. So that would be the opportune moment to do it, is when you have some one-on-one time.
I see.
Great questions. We also developed some goods in partnership with Colorado Legal Services. So they'll be doing all of the dissemination for these to farm workers in Colorado. Some of these are a little bit more overt than covert. So one of these has a direct link to the Colorado Human Trafficking Hotline number. So it's just sunscreen that might go out to farm workers, which you can imagine they might need. And we also have, this is my personal favorite, these covert bandanas. And I'll point it out, and it's going to be very hard to see unless you're looking right at it. There's Spanish language messaging kind of written on the very inside of the paisley, and also our QR code here as well. And what's nice about these is, as you're looking at them, you wouldn't really notice the QR code or the messaging unless you were wearing it or really very close to that person. And so that's another attempt to kind of have that messaging go out in a covert way. And, you know, distributed by professionals who work with farm workers, work on Know Your Rights campaigns, are used to educating and defending that community. So are really in a great place to reach those kind of hard to reach populations for us.
Are you saying the funding's out for this too?
Yes, we still have a plan for distribution, so they haven't all been distributed, but in terms of our ability to purchase and produce more, yes.
What other organizations are doing stuff like this?
That I'm not aware of in terms of like covert goods
I've
specifically.
never heard of covert goods.
Yeah, that's a great question. I am not aware of any others in Colorado, but that's not to say that they're not doing it. I'm realizing that there are a lot of efforts that we're constantly learning about, but this is the only one I'm currently aware of at the moment. Do you see another question?
Well, we have the bracelets with a silicone bracelet with the hotline number on the inside.
Great.
And the outside
Yeah.
says priceless, but the inside is national.
Right. So it looks
Hotline
like
number.
just a typical bracelet that, somebody else would wear.
Right.
And then there's that messaging. That's great.
Kind of outreach to that didn't involve a QR code?
I'm trying to think about what of our messaging did not have that. I'm not sure. I know.
A very specific demographic that maybe eliminate or I'm just old enough that
These questions about demographics are so important. And I will say, we didn't do everything that we could have hoped to do perfectly, right? So, we got feedback. No, like this is like, that's just total honesty, transparency. So the QR codes were on a lot of these kind of smaller items. I think they were even, I have our coasters here as well. So they're on our little coasters for bars and restaurants. Definitely where things are placed and how they're given to people, you're going to reach a different demographic, right? So when we're trying to reach out to bars and restaurants, we're, as patrons, just sitting on the table and you might put your beer on and then go, what's this? We're trying to not necessarily reach people who may be experiencing trafficking in the same way as when we're at a public health clinic and we're giving people covert goods really intentionally. So some of this was like public awareness. We want everyone to know what trafficking looks like so they can identify it and call in. And some of it, you're really trying to reach potential victims of human trafficking. So kind of different lenses. But there were things that we absolutely would have loved to do and we didn't get to cover it all. So for example, we got feedback, bars and restaurants are great, but what about dollar stores, right? So one of our survivor leaders said that, what about dollar stores? That would have been somewhere I would have been able to shop and would have gone during my experience. We didn't cover those as much with the really public facing materials. But so trying to reach different demographics for different reasons, if that helps give a sense. Any other questions? So I was hired on in August to help with Connecting Colorado, which is our federally funded grant project to help address challenges and gaps in addressing human trafficking of children and youth in the state. And our approach to doing this is by trying to create a statewide MDT or multidisciplinary team toolkit. So an MDT, there are several versions of MDT. So if you work in child advocacy, you might know a different one, for example, but MDTs in Colorado that focus on trafficking will be like law enforcement, child welfare, maybe some service providers working together to try to address the needs of trafficking victims, specifically children and youth for this project that they come into contact with. And we're so lucky. This is a very collaborative effort. I'm so lucky because I couldn't do the work I need to do without this much collaboration. So we have some really great sub-grantees on this project. We have the Rocky Mountain Immigrant Advocacy Network. They're doing some of the training and technical assistance on labor trafficking, for example. And they're also providing some direct services under this grant. We have the CSU Social Work Research Center. They're kind of our lead evaluators. And so far they've been tremendously helpful. For example, conducting focus groups with MDTs in Colorado and asking them what's working and what's not about their approach. They are also working on a utility study of the high-risk victims tool for human trafficking that will be coming out soon. And we also have an MDT working group. So this is professionals from the majority of Colorado's MDTs that are able to participate, child advocacy centers, guardian ad litems, prosecutors, law enforcement, we have FBI there, child welfare, really just trying to get as many brains in the room and say, this is what we need in this toolkit to help actually identify the needs of the kids that we're seeing. And then finally, we have a Survivor Leader Advisory Board, which is a set of paid lived experience experts, and they're doing the review for the toolkit, its related trainings, any related materials, and also going to be performing training and technical assistance once we get into implementing the toolkit, which I'll talk about a little bit. We're not there yet. So we have 3 phases. We're in phase 1. I think we're well into phase 1 though. And that's really just focused on developing out the toolkit. So this phase has been all about getting the right people at the table to give us their feedback. So forming that working group, forming that Survivor Leader Advisory Board, and then developing out the toolkit and training. So we're a little over halfway there with that last piece. Then we want to get into beta testing. So how does this toolkit actually work? Thankfully, we have relationships with a lot of these Colorado MDTs that are already practicing. So we'll be having a summit in the fall to introduce a toolkit and then running it out as a beta test with those MDTs. They'll have lots of support on how to use it, lots of training and consultation as they use it. But we'll kind of beta test it there, see what works, what doesn't work, what feels kind of off, and try to fix it. And then expand into 2 communities that don't have MDTs yet, but have an interest in the capacity to create one. And then we'll be doing the same thing, host a summit, train them on it, and make sure they have lots of support, because at that point, they'll not only be trying a new toolkit, but they'll be forming a whole new group and trying to use the toolkit to do that. So they'll have lots of our support along the way. Any questions about this grant project? All right.
I do have one. Doesn't LCHT have a lot on their website about forming different task forces? They have kind of a toolkit there.
They do.
How is this going to be quite distinctive from how?
That's a great question. So this is very specific to MDTs. So one of the things that I'm learning is actually a really big piece of forming an MDT that's different, for example, from a task force, is actually issues around confidentiality in these very specific cases. So one thing that I knew you'd focus on, but I expected to focus on so much, is around creating legal language and finding ways to legally cooperate with each other on these very specific cases. So for task forces, and task force can be a really broad term, right? You want to bring everybody together. The goal is to bring everybody together and have all the heads at the table, have service providers, law enforcement, a variety of perspectives. It's a little bit trickier to do that with an MDT, because you might have, for example, this is something we talk about constantly. You might have an MDT that historically has been mostly law enforcement and prosecution, and they work very well together, and they're very effective at that sliver of, assisting somebody who's experienced human trafficking. But then it's much harder for them to actually have that really effective collaboration with a service provider or like a mental health professional, because the confidentiality agreements that they have, they get a lot messier. So that's one piece that's a little bit different there. And focusing a little bit more on the roles that very specific service providers might have, and their very specific legal obligations and professional guidelines, and how those can all meld together are some things that are kind of addressed here. But certainly there are a lot of projects that this does overlap with in some ways, and ways that they also kind of expand on or kind of take from other projects. So that's a great question, but really trying to kind of hone in on how do we get this group of professionals together for the very specific purpose of serving children and youth who find that they've had this experience, and making sure that all of their case management from beginning to end is really well handled. Is that helpful?
Yes, but you just added a qualifier for children and youth.
Yes. So this is a project that's specific to children and youth. I wasn't here when the grant was written, but that's really because I think we see more MDTs who are more focused on children and youth in Colorado. That's not to say, and I have a hope, right, of course, that at least significant portions of our toolkit could be useful for an MDT that mostly addresses adult victims and their needs. But we're focusing now on children and youth because there's already that knowledge in Colorado. There are already MDTs that are doing this. It follows a model. So the first professionals to do this type of work were child advocacy centers. So that's really where the MDT idea kind of stems from. It's gotten popular in human trafficking, as a result, got popular for children and youth victims. I will say though, this morning I had a conversation with some professionals in Pueblo County who were like, we used to have an adult MDT, and it wasn't specific to trafficking, but like we used to have an adult MDT that was focused on abuse, domestic violence, and that kind of has fallen to the wayside, but that's certainly an option. And so, you know, really, really far out, far down the road, far past the actual work that we're trying to do with this specific project, it would be really terrific if it was also usable, at least informing an MDT and helping people, you know, be trauma responsive in their work, and culturally competent in their work, and, you know, engage with survivors to make sure they're doing the work well, get feedback from the people that they're trying to serve, collaborate across, you know, a variety of different professional spaces without unnecessary conflict about what that looks like. But for now, yes, focus on children and youth.
I have a question on why you haven't involved the people from the place, because you all see trafficking, trafficked kids.
Yeah, we see kids like
as possible, the beta, whatever you call it, could use that as a, you know, a help in testing. I was also thinking about the Truckers Against Trafficking. Are you familiar with that group?
I am actually, yeah. I was here when they presented here as well.
They started from ground one and have developed films and training for drivers.
Yeah.
And I was thinking that they've already invented the wheel, perhaps.
So they have an excellent training. We also, you know, as I mentioned, we have several of our own trainings as well. That's not to knock anybody's training. I think what Truckers Against Trafficking does is really,
might be some more ideas on what.
I think was a little bit different. Actually, I've been hoping to talk to you because the second you started talking about what you do, I was like, why don't we have people at the place? So yes, excellent idea. That's one of the first ideas I had when I sat down today, because we're always, you know, doing our best to expand as much as we can in the project. We also need to have a working group that can function because it's not too big. But it would be really interesting. And we do have folks that represent youth or work in direct services or housing for youth on the MDT. But it would be great to have representation from other organizations that are doing similar work and working with kids and youth really specifically. That's a great idea. It's something we're always trying to do. When it comes to the trainings that we might source from other organizations, we'll probably for this be using some of the trainings we already have, because they're really, really focused, not so much on truck drivers, but they're focused on service providers, law enforcement, people who will be staffing these MDTs. So since we already have the majority of those trainings developed, we're still reviewing them and always trying to make them better. Since they're already pretty strongly developed and focused on what those professionals would need to know, we'll probably use them more for this toolkit. But yes, lots of really wonderful trainings out there as well. And it's always a good idea to kind of meld with them and think, what are they doing that we're not doing? Or, you know, what are they picking up that we're not picking up? And we can also focus on
the seminar, the symposium when it happens in October. That's really excellent in reaching people in the community.
to get more information about that.
I have a question a little bit on this, because I've been back and forth between Denver and Springs the last few years, and so my understanding, there is a pretty, maybe I should backtrack. So I guess you guys connected the toolkit, but there is some pretty strong MDTs already there with the Jack Center, with FBI, and our stuff. So,
yep.
Because I've been on those and virtually attended those. So are you setting a whole new format? Are you elaborating on trying to make that bigger? Or what, I guess, what kind of is the goal? Because it seems like they, comparatively, I don't want to say anything negatively on our end here in the Springs, but we have less of that here, obviously, than I've seen some things up in Denver, as far as that collaborative MDT effort people put.
So that's a great question. ANDAR is actually on our working group, very specifically. And so we're trying to do a couple of things. So there are a variety of models, even though this is very specific work, right? And there aren't really that many child and youth, there are 7. There are 7 child and youth specifically focused human trafficking MDTs in Colorado. There are significantly more that are child focused, for example. One thing we're doing is we are working with professionals on those existing MDTs like ANDAR, great great mention there, who have been doing this work for a really long time. And so they know how they got set up. They know what worked, they know what didn't, they know what they encounter on a regular basis, they know what's hard, what's easy, what they kind of have locked down. And so part of it is really getting that feedback of, hey, you do this already. So since you do this already, we're going to use some of that expertise and say, what would you tell somebody who has no idea what an MDT is, but they're a professional who works in the space, they want to have a more collaborative approach? How would you tell them that you started? What are the things that are obvious to you now that are obvious to you now because you had an experience where you've learned that somehow? So that's part of it. We're also trying to encourage the folks in the working group to also think, okay, so we have this really solid model. How can we improve on it? You know, is there a way to actually improve on it? So thinking, you know, some cross collaboration there. For example, we have multiple folks from data in Denver on the task on this working group, and they're providing some new ideas that are kind of outside of a traditional MDT approach. So talking about how they've been able to get wraparound services, which goes a little bit outside of that really traditional law enforcement prosecution, maybe child welfare at the table, and is more like, who are community advocates that we can reach out to? Who are nonprofits we can reach out to? And they're really expansive. So kind of also learning from that as well. And so the goal is some of this toolkit, when we release it to people in our working group who are on MDTs, won't be useful to them because they already did it, right? So they already have created the guidance on how to create an MDT, how to write that MOU that we were talking about, how to do this legal process, how to get everybody at the table, how to collaborate without violating confidentiality. So some of that will be common knowledge to them. But the hope is that when we release this to new communities that don't have an MDT, their common knowledge, yeah, I know how to do this. This is interesting. This is my everyday, will be really important to those professionals who are like, we haven't done this before. This is hard. Because a lot of them do talk about having those difficult experiences of starting up and not quite knowing how.
Well, and I don't want to get into much elaborate. Because that's been always one of my passions anyway, because I've come from law enforcement piece, seen nonprofit. I mean, I've seen forensic, but nobody's really connected enough that we're collaborating, and obviously victim survivors take the hit. So, yeah. First, I commend that you guys are taking more proactive engagement on this because it's really needed. And you know, it'd be wonderful. This is so much a start of it here anyway, because this is collaborative, but to really be able to expand on that. So one quick question. So when you get this put together, then it will be available for like the community here, right? So this is our toolkit. This is what it looks like. Do you have, how will that look?
That's a great question. I think we might try to roll it out really specifically with MDTs because it will be that really professional collaboration focus.
So the collaboration already has to be in place, basically?
It has to be forming. It has to be forming. So I know that Springs does have a Metro Focus sex trafficking MDT. One of their current, potentially soon to be former members is on a working group, will continue to stay on a working group. They also have experience with an MDT in California, so they have a lot of perspective. But certainly we're trying to kind of hit those communities that have those MDTs, and also, you know, encourage, I know that you're talking about kind of things being a little bit siloed here, try to encourage a little bit less of that siloing through this project as well, which I think we have a lot of really positive response to throughout the working group. So.
I didn't put you on the spot with that question.
No, not at all. I'm thrilled. I don't normally get nearly as many questions, but I can talk about this project because I do it. So,
well, and so I commend you because it's so needed. And it just is. That's, I mean, because there is so many good resources, but if they're not all working together, because it takes that. I mean, it really does, especially within the trafficking. And it can't be, it gets fragmented and have issues. It's just hard. And again, I've come from one side of it a lot to see that. But yeah, how come we aren't talking about it? Yeah. Thank you for what you're doing. It'll be good to start.
Great, thank you. Yeah, I think one thing that's been really nice is, you know, talking about trying to kind of collaborate. We held our service provider workshop for the working group, which is partially for them to have the training and partially for them to give us feedback. And one thing that I think was really wonderful that came out of that is all these different departments have different rules about what they can and cannot do. More can't in some cases, right? So DHS, for example, cannot legally transport children and youth to, you know, to court, to service provider meetings or anything like that. But they need to go to those meetings. They need to get services. They need to have access to those things. And somehow they have to get there. And if you send something like a lift, a lot of kids will be like, I don't know you. I don't want to get in the car with a total stranger. But they might be willing to get in the car with a guardian ad litem or somebody who knows them. And if that person can't legally drive them, that creates a huge barrier. And so then you're forced as a service provider to go, am I going to follow the rules or am I going to get this kid where they need to go? And you can imagine that some people are making the latter call, but I'm not going to name any names. So with that, we're talking about how do people actually get transportation? And somebody had an example from El Paso where it used to be that for kids that were unaccompanied foreign nationals, they actually had one community member who would go and pick up all the kids that needed to go to court on a certain day. They all knew her because she was a part of their community. They all felt safe with her. She knew how court worked. She knew the judges. She knew the people working there. And she was able to make them comfortable. And they were able to legally transport all the kids with this safe driver who they were comfortable with. And they would get there and back safely. They would have somebody who would answer questions about the way that court works, which, it's really, really daunting how court works, even if, you speak English fluently and you've been prepped on it. It's just a really daunting space, especially when you're a kid. So having that support and a driver was one way they solved that problem. Somebody from data in Denver heard about that and they went to their boss the next day and said, we're buying a car. So having that collaboration, people learn from each other and it's really great to see. So I realize we've been talking for about 46 minutes. How much, I want to make sure I'm respecting your time too.
Yeah, it's how much more do you have?
I have task force recommendations, and it depends a little bit on how many questions you all ask. But I have recommendations from our task forces, and I can talk about them in a little bit less depth as well, with the caveat that, of course, you can also access all of them on our website, on the report, and feel free to email me as many questions as you have. So all right. Yeah, I'm going to fly a little bit. So I'm going to skip some slides, but they're there, and I can also share this presentation or the report. So we had 3 task forces. One of them was our Equitable Access Task Force, really focused on rural human trafficking victims and survivors. And essentially, these recommendations come down to 2 broad categories. One is that we really need more awareness of the services that do exist that can be used in rural areas. So for example, Colorado Legal Services does work in those rural areas, but if you don't know about them, that's a big problem. So trying to kind of expand the awareness of existing services to those areas. For example, by using technology that at-risk populations use in those areas as well. So that's one broad category. And the other broad category is to actually expand the services to rural areas. So that can be as simple as a larger organization working with a smaller organization in a rural area as a sub-grantee. So their services can be a little bit more robust and well-funded. I'm skipping for a strategic reason here. We also had our Survivor Engagement Task Force. They had very many recommendations for the council, which is excellent because it was their job to codify not only what we already do, but what we need to be doing for better survivor engagement. They had several recommendations, but one of them was that we should write a mission and vision statement because we had these guiding principles and it was kind of confusing and hard to talk about what the council is, what it does. And when you're trying to engage survivor leaders to work on your council and you can't actually succinctly say what you do, that's a problem. So we actually worked on our own mission and vision statement in January of this year on that recommendation. One of their other recommendations is have a permanent task force on this. So we have that task force in 2023 as well. There's a lot more here, as you can see. So those are some broad highlights. And then finally, we had a legislative task force. This came about as just something that got added to our plate a little bit last minute last year. Essentially, we heard that there was some legislation coming down that might completely change the entire work of the council. We're like, well, we want to have input on that because that affects our work. So this task force spent about half a year really heavily involved with the Colorado legislative session, providing feedback to law enforcement, to lawmakers, and also testifying during legislative sessions. So they really had to be kind of ready to roll. But they also provided 3 recommendations I think are really important for 2023. One is that we need a law that allows us to pay the survivor leaders on the council. Currently, if you're serving on the council, you are not paid as a survivor leader. And that's because of the way the law is written that forms our council, is that no one is paid. But we're unique. Not a lot of Colorado boards through the governor's office actually have survivors. There's only one other that has survivor or survivor advocate, but that survivor advocate could be paid another way to be there. So we're like, okay, we want to pay our survivor leaders. We want them to be paid like the experts they are. So that's one of our legislative recommendations. Another legislative recommendation, we were talking about this earlier, and I forget who had this comment, was about vacature for victims of human trafficking, so survivors and victims of human trafficking who have been charged with a crime that they committed as a direct result of being trafficked. So this is kind of a national standard that says, hey, this person shouldn't have been convicted in the first place. We're going to erase that from their record because it shouldn't be an impediment to them going forward. And the third, and we've made this recommendation before, is that we need public benefits for foreign nationals who have been a victim of human trafficking and are applying for a T or a U visa. Because currently, if you get that T or a U visa, that means you're eligible for public benefits. But if you're waiting, if that's pending, you're not eligible for public benefits. And so as those processes start to take longer and longer, because offices are not as well staffed, that's a longer amount of time that somebody who should have those benefits is just waiting because they haven't been given the right status. So those are the 3 main recommendations from that legislative task force. In 2023, we have slightly fewer priorities because we're trying to really focus in. We'll continue our data collection and training. We'll continue that MDT project because we're grant funded to do so. And our task forces this year will be focused on survivor engagement and also on education. So trying to bring more public awareness about human trafficking into Colorado state school system. These are brand new task forces. I don't have a lot more to say there in terms of the direction or the strategies that we'll take, but that's a kind of broad idea of where we are. Of course, always happy to answer more questions now or by email. That's why my email is here. So feel free to contact me really anytime with any questions, any feedback, whatever is interesting to you about this presentation. If you're interested in our trainings, especially that law enforcement training, which we're trying to get beta testers for, I have Cameron Reasoner's contact information here. She's our human trafficking training and technical assistance lead. It's a big title for somebody who does very many jobs. Her contact is there as well. You all have about as many questions per slide as most groups have had per presentation. And it's really wonderful to see how engaged you are. And it's made me think, it's given me ideas, and I really appreciate always the energy in this collaboration. So thank you.
All right.
Thank you.
Thank you. Well, that's a wrap then. Feel free to stick around, talk to Catie.
I can take more questions.
You for one another, and hopefully we'll see you next week.
Thank you.